He took the microphone from my daughter's graduation coordinator like he'd earned the right to it. 200 people watched him smile, that easy, practiced smile I used to love. Then he said the words that would end our marriage in front of everyone I knew. I sat frozen in my dress uniform, 18 years of my life collapsing into 11 seconds of silence. And then before I could even breathe, my daughter stood up. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know. I want to tell you how we got here because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I was 30 years old when I found out I couldn't have children. 2 years of trying, 2 years of appointments and needles and calendars marked in red ink, and then a doctor with kind eyes telling me the word unlikely, in a way that meant never. I remember sitting in the parking lot of that clinic in my car, still in uniform and not crying. I'd learned a long time ago how to hold things. That's what 14 years in the Army teaches you. If nothing else, how to carry weight without letting your face show it. Daniel took it hard too, or at least that's what I believed at the time. We talked about adoption. We talked about waiting. Mostly we just stopped talking about it at all the way people do when a wound gets too familiar to keep touching. I was deployed more than I was home in those years. That's the truth. Nobody puts on a recruiting poster the missed birthdays, the phone calls cut short by static and time zones, the ache of loving someone from 4,000 miles away. Daniel handled the distance worse than I expected. I told myself it was loneliness. I didn't yet understand what loneliness could turn into. Then one evening I came home from a 9-month rotation and found him standing in the living room holding a baby. I remember the smell of the house first. Something unfamiliar, formula and baby powder wrong in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up. Daniel's face was gray. He didn't even say hello. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. The baby was his. A woman named Renee, someone from his office, someone I'd shaken hands with once at a Christmas party, and thought nothing of. She hadn't wanted the responsibility, that's the word he used, responsibility, like the baby in his arms was a line item instead of a life. He said she'd signed away her rights. He said he didn't know what else to do. He said he was sorry over and over until the words stopped meaning anything. I could have walked out that night. Looking back, I think most people would have understood if I had. My marriage had been broken in the worst possible way by the worst possible betrayal, and I owed this stranger's daughter nothing at all. But then I looked at her. She was maybe 8 months old, dark-haired, wide-eyed, entirely unaware that she'd just become the center of a war she had no part in starting. She looked up at me with an expression that had nothing to do with Daniel or Renee or any of the choices the adults around her had made. She just looked tired and hungry and small. I don't know how to explain what happened in me in that moment, except to say that something that had been broken in the clinic parking lot 2 years earlier suddenly found a way to matter again. I reached out. She wrapped her whole fist around one of my fingers. I named her Emily after my grandmother. I didn't have to. Daniel said I could call her whatever I wanted since I was the one who was going to be raising her, since he had never been much good at the day-to-day work of loving someone. I remember thinking even then that this was the first honest thing he'd said to me in weeks. That was 18 years ago. Now I was sitting in a folding chair in a high school auditorium watching that same little girl walk across a stage in a blue cap and gown, and I had never in my life felt prouder of anything. Not my commission, not my medals, not a single one of the achievements that filled the walls of my office. Nothing came close to watching Emily Foster cross that stage as valedictorian, her voice steady, her chin lifted, thanking her teachers and her friends, and I'll never forget this part, thanking her mother, for never once making me feel like I was anyone's mistake. I had to look down at my hands so no one would see me cry. And then the principal invited Daniel up to say a few words since he'd made a donation toward the new science wing, since appearances had always mattered more to him than substance. I remember thinking foolishly that he might actually rise to the occasion. 18 years is a long time. People change. Fathers find their way back to gratitude, even late. He took the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, found my eyes, and smiled that same easy smile. "I just want to say," he said, "thank you to my wife Natalie for raising my mistress's daughter all these years." The auditorium went absolutely silent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. 18 years of birthday parties and school pickups and fevers in the middle of the night reduced in front of hundreds of strangers to 5 words that weren't even accurate. Renee had never been his mistress, not legally. Not really, just a mistake he'd made once and never fully owned. But accuracy wasn't the point. Humiliation was the point. He wanted everyone in that room to know that the woman who had raised his daughter wasn't really her mother at all. I felt my whole body go cold. And then before I could even decide what I was going to do, Emily rose from her seat in the front row, turned to face her father, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know." To understand what Emily was about to say, you have to go back to the night everything started 18 years before that graduation stage, in a house that still smelled like the life I thought I was living. I was 30 years old, freshly home from a deployment that had stretched 2 months past its original date, still adjusting to sleeping in a bed that didn't shift under me. Daniel had picked me up from the base, looking strange, not happy to see me, not exactly nervous, just off in a way I couldn't name yet. I remember thinking maybe he'd wrecked the car or lost his job. I wasn't prepared for what he actually said. "There's something I need to tell you," he told me, standing in our kitchen with his hands flat on the counter like he needed it to hold him up. Then he told me about Renee, about the affair, about the baby that had been born 3 weeks earlier, a baby he hadn't mentioned once during any of our calls, a baby he'd apparently known about for the better part of a year. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think people romanticize forgiveness too easily. I did not feel noble. I felt like the floor had opened underneath me. I had just spent 2 years grieving a body that couldn't carry a child. And here was proof that the problem had never been fertility at all. It had been him choosing someone else while I was overseas doing a job that required me to trust the people I'd left behind. I told him I wanted a divorce. I meant it completely in that moment with my whole chest. And then he brought her in from the other room. Emily was so small. Not sleeping awake alert, watching me with the particular seriousness that some babies have, like they're taking attendance of the room. Daniel said Renee didn't want the responsibility of raising her alone, that she'd asked him to take custody, that if I left, he honestly didn't know what would happen to this child. He wasn't a man built for solo parenting. I understood that about him even then. I stood in that kitchen holding my rage in one hand and this stranger's daughter's future in the other, and I made a decision that would define the next 18 years of my life. I picked her up. She didn't cry. She just curled her small fist around my finger and held on the way infants do, reflexively, without meaning, and yet it felt like meaning anyway. I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me, she didn't betray me. She's a child. She didn't do anything except get born into a mess she had no say in. That became the sentence I repeated to myself for the next 2 decades, on every hard day that followed. I didn't divorce Daniel that year. I told myself I was staying for Emily, and that was true, but if I'm honest, there was something else too, a stubbornness in me that refused to let his mistake be the thing that broke my life apart. I decided I would build something out of the wreckage instead of walking away from it. The years that followed blur together in the best way, the way good years do. I remember dropping Emily off at preschool in her too big backpack, watching her wave at me through the glass door like I was the only person in the world worth waving at. I remember the deployments where I missed her recitals and her first day of kindergarten, the way I'd call every single night regardless of time zone, whispering bedtime stories over static-filled lines while she fell asleep with the phone still pressed to her ear on the other end. I remember sitting up with her through a 104-degree fever when she was 6, sponging her forehead with cool water while Daniel slept undisturbed down the hall. Too tired from work, he said, to be much help. I remember every parent-teacher conference, every science fair board glued together at midnight, every scraped knee and broken heart, and the year she decided she hated math until I found a tutor who made her love it again. I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, gripping the door handle while she stalled the car for the 5th time, and laughed until she cried. I taught her how to change a tire, how to read a lease before she signed it, how to tell when someone was lying to her, a skill I'll admit I'd developed out of necessity. Daniel was present for some of it. Birthdays mostly. Photos always. He liked being photographed as a father, more than he liked the daily work of being one. As the years passed, he grew more distant, more entangled in his career, more prone to long nights I never asked too many questions about. I told myself that was simply who he was. Some people give what they have to give, and no more. But Emily never once treated our relationship as anything less than real. She called me Mom from the time she could speak. Not stepmom, not Dad's wife, just Mom, plain and unqualified, and every time she said it, something in me that had been broken years earlier by a doctor with kind eyes and a hard word quietly mended itself a little further. I used to think motherhood required a body that could carry a child. Emily taught me otherwise, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. What I didn't fully understand back then was that Daniel had started to see all of this differently. where I saw a family we'd built together out of a terrible beginning. He had begun quietly, and without ever saying so out loud, to see my raising of Emily as something owed to him, a debt I was paying off for a mistake he'd made, rather than a life I had chosen for myself, out of love every single day since that night in the kitchen. That distinction would matter more than I could have guessed standing in that auditorium 18 years later watching my daughter rise to defend the truth he'd tried to rewrite. I didn't make a scene in that auditorium. That was never who I was, not even in the moment I had every right to be. When Daniel stepped down from the stage after his little speech, red-faced, now that the room's silence had turned uncomfortable, even for him, I simply stood, smoothed my uniform jacket, and said 4 words. "We'll talk at home." Calm, level. The voice I used to use giving orders to soldiers twice the size of most men in that room. Daniel actually looked relieved, like he thought this meant I'd absorbed the humiliation the way I'd absorbed so much else over the years. He thought this would be like every other time, a hard conversation, a strained week, then a slow return to normal. He had no idea I'd stopped returning to normal months earlier. Looking back, the signs had been there since spring. I just hadn't let myself read them the way you don't read a letter you're afraid will change everything. Daniel had started coming home late without explanation, his phone suddenly requiring a passcode where before he'd left it face up on the kitchen counter for years. He'd changed the password on our joint email account and never gave me the new one. When I brought up retirement planning, or whether we should finally take that trip to Portugal we'd talked about for a decade, he'd changed the subject to something financial and technical numbers instead of dreams, as if he were quietly excusing himself from a future he no longer intended to share. I am by training and temperament an observer. 14 years of active duty teaches you to notice what people are trying not to show you. So once I let myself actually look, I saw everything. I saw that Daniel wasn't simply distracted. He was preparing for something. It took some quiet, careful work. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I'm proud of, exactly, just paying attention to mail that arrived and disappeared quickly, to a financial advisor's business card left carelessly in his coat pocket, to a late-night phone call I overheard fragments of through a bathroom door. Piece by piece I understood. Daniel was planning to leave. Worse, he'd reconnected with Renee, not romantically, or not only romantically, but strategically. The two of them apparently aligned on something involving Emily, and I would later learn involving me. The blow that actually knocked the wind out of me came almost by accident when I found a folder in his desk drawer I wasn't supposed to see. Inside were photocopies, Emily's original birth certificate listing Renee as the biological mother, and Daniel as the father, with a blank space where a second parent's name might have gone. There was no adoption decree, no formal guardianship paperwork. In 18 years and all our conversations about lawyers and finances and Emily's future, Daniel had never once mentioned that I had no legal standing as her mother at all. I understood immediately what this meant and what he intended to do with it. In a divorce, in a fight over the house, over savings, over the story, the world would be told about who had failed, whom Daniel meant to use this fact as a weapon. Not because it reflected any truth about our life together, but because it would look devastating on paper, because a judge, a lawyer, an audience of onlookers wouldn't know 18 years of fevers and driving lessons and midnight phone calls from deployment. They would only know what the paperwork said. And the paperwork said I was nobody. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time that evening, in an empty house, feeling something harden in me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. Because here is what Daniel didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn about the woman he married. I am not someone who lets a story get told about me that isn't true. For 18 years, without ever intending it as ammunition, I had kept records not out of suspicion, but out of the discipline the Army had drilled into me since I was 22 years old. Every school enrollment form I'd signed as Emily's guardian. Every medical consent form, every pediatrician's visit, every field trip permission slip, every insurance document listing me as her primary caregiver. Emails between Daniel and me discussing her education, her therapy after a hard year in middle school, her college fund, all of it in my handwriting, my signature, my name attached to 18 years of showing up. I had never once imagined I would need this evidence to prove I was Emily's mother. I had simply been a woman who kept careful files because that was who the Army had made me, because chaos had never suited me, not in deployment, and not in domestic life either. Now, sitting alone with that folder Daniel never intended for me to find, I understood that discipline was about to become something else entirely. Not a weapon exactly, I never wanted to hurt him, not really, not even then. But armor, proof. The truth organized and dated and undeniable, waiting quietly in a filing cabinet for the moment someone tried to say it hadn't happened. Daniel thought he held all the power in what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he was preparing to discard had spent 18 years without ever meaning to preparing for exactly this fight. I didn't want Emily anywhere near what was coming. That was the promise I made myself the night I found that folder. Whatever happened between Daniel and me, I would not let it become her burden to carry. She had spent 18 years as the child caught between two adults' choices. I refused to let her spend her last summer before college as a casualty of a war she hadn't started. So I sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, the same table where I'd checked her homework and celebrated report cards for over a decade, and I chose my words carefully. Whatever happens between your father and me, I told her, you don't have to choose. This isn't yours to fix, it never was. She nodded quiet in a way that should have told me she already knew more than I'd given her credit for. I've since learned that 18-year-olds are far more perceptive than we like to believe, especially about the people who raised them. It turned out Emily had heard a phone call 3 weeks earlier one Daniel thought he'd made in private late one night when he assumed she was asleep upstairs. She'd come down for water and paused at the bottom of the stairs when she heard her father's voice, low and unfamiliar, talking to a woman Emily didn't recognize by name, but understood immediately by context. Renee. Her biological mother, a woman she'd never met, being discussed like a business partner rather than a stranger who'd given birth to her and walked away. What stopped Emily on those stairs wasn't the fact of the call itself. It was one sentence delivered so casually it barely registered as cruelty to the man who said it. Natalie was never really her mother, Daniel had said. Emily told me this 3 days later, her voice steady but her eyes glassy in a way I recognized from every hard moment of her childhood, the fevers, the scraped knees the year in middle school, when a friend group turned cruel. This was worse than any of those. This wasn't pain inflicted by circumstance. This was pain inflicted by her own father in a sentence he hadn't even meant for her to hear, which somehow made it more honest and more devastating. She confronted him directly. I wasn't in the room, but she told me about it afterward, almost word for word the way people do when a conversation has burned itself permanently into memory. Daniel had tried to explain himself, tried to draw some legal distinction between raising a child and being one's mother, some technicality about biology and paperwork that he seemed to think would soften what he'd said. Emily didn't let him finish. Then where were you, she asked him, when I needed someone. He didn't have an answer. Of course he didn't. There wasn't one that wouldn't indict him. That conversation cracked something open that had been sealed for years. Emily told me haltingly about a memory she'd never shared with me before, a fight she'd half overheard. When she was maybe 7 or 8, Daniel's voice raised, saying something about how maybe it would be simpler if Emily went to live with her birth mother instead, since things were complicated the way they were. She hadn't understood it then, not fully. She'd filed it away the way children do with things too large to process, a splinter she carried without knowing its name. I remembered that period differently, of course. I remembered fighting Daniel on exactly that idea, refusing to let him destabilize a child who had already lost one mother's presence in her life before she could even form memories of it. I remembered telling him that uprooting Emily, now sending her to a woman she'd never known, would be a second abandonment dressed up as a solution. I'd won that argument. I'd never told Emily how close it had come to going the other way. Hearing it now at 18, with the context of everything else falling into place around her, Emily finally understood something I don't think she'd ever fully let herself see before the woman her father called a burden, an obligation, my mistress's daughter, in front of 200 strangers. That woman was the one who had fought to keep her, who had chosen her actively, repeatedly, at every turn where choosing would have been easier not to make. I watched something shift in my daughter over those few days. She'd always been steady, thoughtful, slower to anger than most teenagers I'd known. But there was a new firmness in her now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. I'm not letting him rewrite what happened, she told me, and I believed her completely, though I had no idea yet what that would come to mean. I didn't ask her to defend me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I would never have asked an 18-year-old to fight my battles in front of a crowded auditorium. Whatever Emily decided to do at that graduation, she decided on her own with a clear head and a heart that had finally connected all the scattered pieces of her own history into a single, undeniable truth. She wasn't protecting me because I asked her to. She was protecting the truth because she'd finally understood exactly what it was. I made an appointment with a family law attorney 3 weeks before Emily's graduation, though I hadn't yet told her why. I didn't walk into that office wanting to destroy Daniel. I want to be honest about that because revenge stories are easy to tell and harder to live. And what I actually felt sitting in that waiting room wasn't rage. It was clarity. I simply needed to understand precisely and without illusion where I stood. The attorney's name was Diane Whitfield, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on top of graying hair, and a manner that suggested she'd heard every version of my story before, and none of them surprised her anymore. I laid out the folder I'd found: the birth certificate, the absence of any adoption or guardianship decree, 18 years of a life I'd built around a child the law didn't officially recognize as mine. Diane didn't flinch. She'd handled cases like this before. She told me more often than people would guess. She explained the concept of de facto parentage, the legal recognition some states extend to a person who has functioned as a parent in every meaningful way, even without formal adoption. She explained that the mountain of documentation I'd unknowingly assembled over 18 years — school enrollment forms, medical consents, insurance records, tax filings, listing Emily as a dependent, every email discussing her education and well-being — wasn't just sentimental clutter, it was evidence. Substantial, dated, corroborated evidence of exactly the kind courts take seriously. We went through the rest of it methodically. The house still in both our names, since we'd bought it together 12 years earlier. Retirement accounts I'd contributed to steadily throughout my career, including the retirement benefits I had earned through my years of military service, along with the assets and savings that were legally mine, regardless of what Daniel believed about who deserved what. Emily's college fund, which I had funded almost entirely myself, a fact Daniel had never once acknowledged aloud. Diane looked over my file for a long moment, then looked up at me with something like respect. "He clearly wasn't expecting you to be prepared," she said. I almost laughed. Preparation had never been the plan. It had simply been who I was. There was one piece of evidence Diane found particularly useful, one I hadn't even known existed until she requested Daniel's financial records as part of the discovery process weeks later. An email sent to Renee 8 months earlier that Daniel apparently hadn't been careful enough to delete from a shared cloud account tied to an old joint subscription neither of us had bothered to cancel. In it, he'd written something that told me more about how little he understood me than anything he'd said in 18 years of marriage. "Natalie will never leave," he'd written. "She has nowhere else to go." I read that sentence 3 times before I fully absorbed what it revealed. Not malice exactly. Something worse, a complete failure to see me at all. He believed I had built my entire identity around him, that 18 years of sacrifice had left me hollowed out and dependent, with no separate self capable of walking away. He had no idea that I had a career that had never depended on him, a pension that was entirely my own, a professional reputation built through my own discipline across 3 deployments. He had no idea that the person he thought had nowhere else to go had in fact quietly built an entire life that could stand without him the moment it needed to. Most of all, he had no idea that Emily, the daughter he called a burden in front of strangers, had already chosen without hesitation which parent she stood beside. I made my decision in Diane's office that afternoon. I would not try to punish Daniel beyond what the law and the truth naturally required. I wasn't interested in destroying his career or humiliating him further than his own choices already had. That kind of revenge might have felt satisfying for a week, but it wasn't who I wanted to be for the rest of my life, and it certainly wasn't the example I wanted to leave with Emily as she stepped into adulthood. Instead, I asked Diane to prepare the divorce filing, and to make sure my legal standing regarding Emily, now technically an adult but symbolically vital to me, was documented clearly and permanently in every relevant record. I wanted the truth on paper finally, the way it had always been true in practice. That same week, without announcement or confrontation, I moved my things out of the bedroom Daniel and I had shared for over a decade and into the guest room down the hall. I didn't slam doors. I didn't leave notes. I simply stopped pretending that anything between us was still intact and let the silence of that decision speak for itself. Daniel noticed, of course. He asked me once almost gently if we could talk things through. I told him we could talk once the paperwork was filed and not before. He looked at me differently after that, not with anger, but with something closer to unease, as though he was beginning to understand for the first time in 18 years that the woman standing in front of him was no longer someone he could manage with a well-timed apology and a familiar smile. He had spent so long believing I would always absorb whatever he handed me. He was about to learn in front of everyone who mattered to us exactly how wrong he'd been. Let me take you back to that auditorium, because everything I've told you until now has been leading to this single moment. The graduation ceremony had been perfect until then, the kind of afternoon you replay in your mind for years afterward, sunlight coming through the high windows of the gymnasium. The smell of fresh flowers from the stage decorations, 200 families packed into folding chairs, proud and restless and ready to celebrate. Emily had just delivered her valedictorian address, and I had cried without shame the way I imagine every parent in that room had cried at some point that afternoon. Then the principal called Daniel up to say a few words and everything changed in the space of a single sentence. "Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter." The room went silent in that specific way. Large crowds go silent, not peaceful but suspended, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I felt every eye in that auditorium shift toward me. I felt my own face go hot, then cold, then strangely calm the way it sometimes does in the field when a situation turns dangerous, and your training simply takes over. I hadn't planned what I would do. I want to be honest about that. I had no speech prepared, no counterattack rehearsed. I was simply sitting there absorbing the fact that 18 years of my life had just been reduced publicly to a punchline about someone else's mistake. And then Emily stood up. She didn't rush. That's what I remember most clearly, the unhurried way she rose from her seat in the front row, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked toward the small stage where her father still stood holding the microphone, apparently unaware yet of what was about to happen to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. When she spoke, it was in the same measured, steady tone she'd used delivering her valedictorian address minutes earlier, the tone of someone who had rehearsed nothing and needed to. "You thanked Mom for raising your mistress's daughter," she said, and the microphone Daniel still held picked up every word, carried it to the back row, to the balcony, to every parent and teacher and stranger in that room. "But you forgot one thing." She turned then and looked directly at me. I remember the exact expression on her face, not anger, not performance, just a kind of fierce, unwavering love that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "She didn't raise your mistress's daughter," Emily said. "She raised her daughter." I heard the room shift beneath that sentence, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Parents leaning toward each other, phones quietly rising to record what everyone in that room now understood was happening in real time. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Emily wasn't finished, and something in her posture made it clear that no one was going to interrupt her. "You weren't there when I was sick," she said. "You weren't there when I was afraid. You weren't the one waiting outside my school when I forgot my ride. You weren't the one who taught me what it means to keep a promise." Each sentence landed like a measured blow, not cruel, just true, which somehow made it worse for the man standing frozen at the center of the stage. I watched Daniel's face change in real time. The practiced ease draining out of it, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen from him in years. Emily let the silence sit for a moment before she delivered the sentence that would end up weeks later quoted back to me by strangers who'd somehow seen the footage online. "So if you're embarrassed that Mom raised your daughter," she said, "you should be embarrassed that you didn't." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. I watched a man who had spent 18 years believing he held all the power in our family realize in front of everyone whose opinion he'd ever cared about that he had misjudged everything. Emily turned away from him then and looked back at me. "And I'm not your mistress's daughter anymore," she said, her voice softening for the first time, something breaking gently open in it. "I'm Mom's daughter." I don't remember standing up. I only remember that at some point I was on my feet and Emily was crossing the small distance between the stage and the front row, and I was holding my daughter the way I'd held her that very first night, 18 years earlier, when she was small enough to fit in one arm, and the whole rest of our story was still unwritten. The auditorium was silent for a few seconds longer. Then someone in the back began clapping, a teacher I learned later, and the sound spread through the room like something catching fire until the whole gymnasium was on its feet, applauding not for a valedictorian speech but for a truth that had finally been spoken out loud by the one person whose voice mattered most. Daniel stood alone on that stage, microphone still in his hand, and for the first time in 18 years, no one in that room was looking at him at all. Daniel found me in the parking lot afterward while Emily was still surrounded by friends and teachers offering congratulations she deserved, and he no longer had any claim to. He looked smaller out there in the afternoon light, the confidence that had carried him through 200 witnesses now completely gone. "I made a mistake," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and when I spoke, my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "No, Daniel," I said. "You made choices. It was the only thing I said to him that day that could be called a kind of revenge, and even that wasn't meant as cruelty. It was simply the truth delivered without the softening I'd spent 18 years offering him out of habit. A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make again and again until it becomes who you are. Daniel had chosen distance over presence, self-interest over partnership, and finally standing on that stage, humiliation over the family he claimed to want to preserve. None of that was a mistake. It was a pattern, and patterns don't deserve the same forgiveness accidents do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list his failures. I simply told him that I had spent 18 years building a family, and that he was the one who had torn it down one quiet betrayal at a time, long before that microphone ever reached his hand. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that matters most. The divorce proceeded through the courts the way divorces do, methodically without theatrics. Diane handled the details with the same steady competence she'd shown from our first meeting. The assets were divided according to the law, and the documentation I'd unknowingly spent 18 years assembling, not everything I might have fought for if I'd wanted to be vindictive, but everything that was rightfully mine, and nothing more. I never asked for anything beyond that. I didn't need to punish Daniel to feel like the truth had finally been told. Daniel lost far more than assets in the months that followed. He lost Emily's trust almost entirely, not through any dramatic rupture, but through her quiet, deliberate distance. Fewer calls, shorter visits, a wall that hadn't existed before, and that he had built himself one absence at a time, long before she ever knew to notice it. Renee, it turned out, had no more genuine interest in rebuilding a relationship with either of them than she'd shown 18 years earlier. Whatever Daniel believed reconnecting with her might restore it didn't materialize into anything lasting. Emily kept calling me Mom. She never wavered on that, not once, not even in the private moments when it would have been easiest to let the label slip into something more complicated. I think she understood better than most adults I know that the word had never been about biology in the first place. I stayed in the Army. There was something steadying about returning to the structure of that life after everything else had shifted so completely, the discipline, the clarity, the sense of purpose that had carried me through every hard year since I was 22 years old. A few months later, Emily left for college, her dorm room packed into the back of my car, both of us pretending neither of us was fighting back tears the entire drive. Before she walked into that dormitory building, she handed me a small, carefully wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photograph of the two of us taken at her graduation, both of us laughing at something now lost to memory. Underneath it, she'd had a single line engraved into the frame. "You didn't give birth to me. You gave me a life." I stood in that parking lot and cried harder than I had in 18 years, harder even than the day I first held her. I think about that clinic parking lot often now, the one from all those years ago, the doctor's voice telling me the word unlikely in a tone meant to be gentle. I spent a long time believing that moment had defined the shape of my life, a door closing, a future narrowing. I understand now how wrong I was. That closed door simply made room for a different one to open, one I never could have predicted, holding a child who wasn't mine by blood, but became mine by every choice that mattered. Being a mother, I've learned, was never about giving birth. It was about staying, protecting, sacrificing without keeping score. Loving someone on the hard days as fiercely as the easy ones. Choosing a child over and over long after anyone would have blamed you for walking away. My husband thought he was exposing me that day on that stage. He never realized he was giving his daughter the chance to finally tell the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Blood may create a family, but love, sacrifice, and loyalty are what make one. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me. We have new stories like this one every single day, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this one. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going together.